It is such an honor to be with you today. Thank you so much for welcoming me into your space, and thank you so much, Sister Angela. What? For channeling MLK this morning. Thank you. Seriously, thank you so much for that. That was fabulous. I'm going to be speaking a little bit out of his book where that he wrote after giving that speech. Where do we go from here? It was written in 1967, only months before he was assassinated. And the byline or the subtitle is Chaos or Community. I think you'll if you get this book, and I highly recommend this is your next read, in addition to this one. When you read this book, one of the things that you will recognize immediately is that he was a prophet and that he was speaking directly into our time right now. There are 4 words, my friends, 4 words on the first page of the Bible that for me unlocked everything, and I want to share them with you before we get into the meat of our time today. These words will help us to understand and grasp the theological significance of the times we are living in right now and what we are experiencing in our everyday lives as democracy itself is being attacked. And as a result, the beloved community, the vision of Dr. King, the beloved community itself is under attack. These words come to us from people who had been enslaved for 70 years. They were enslaved in Babylon. They were taken from their own land and enslaved in another land and told by the Babylonians that they were not created by God, or the gods as the Babylonians understood, to be image bearers of God. No, instead, they were created to be slaves. They were created to be slaves of the gods, and because they were the prizes of war, slaves to their oppressors. And so as these priests who were exiting Babylon sat down and they said, you know, we need to critique the worldview of our oppressors. And so they looked at that worldview and they said, let's write down our own creation story. And what they said when they wrote down their creation story, you've heard it, you've seen it. It's actually less of a story and more of an epic poem. And we get to the 6th day in this epic Hebrew poem, a 7-day structure, which is typical epic Hebrew poetry. And we get to the pinnacle of this 6th day, and we see the creation of humanity. And I'll get back to that, but at the end of the 6th day, God looks around and says, this is very good. Very good. Tov me'od. Now, tov me'od is particular. You see, because that goodness, as we have come to understand it, it lives inside of the thing. The Greeks taught us what goodness is. The Greeks taught us perfection, somebody, perfecting church. The Greeks taught us that perfection lives inside the thing. So their big project was to find the perfectly level floor or be the perfect person, or just perfection was in the thing. You tried to be perfect. But that was not the way that Hebrews understood the concept of perfection. The Hebrews understood perfection or goodness or tov me'od, which is radical goodness, to not exist inside the thing, but rather to exist between things. It existed in the ties between things. It was fundamentally relational. It was fundamentally ethical. So when God looked around at the end of the 6th day and said, yo, this is very good, what God was saying was not, that's a really good walrus I just made. Or that's a very good or a perfect cloud I just made. Or a perfect human being. Rather, what God was saying, how the original Hebrews would have heard it and understood it, is that God was saying the relationships between all things that I have created is radically good. The relationship between humanity and God was radically good. The relationship between men and women, and hello, all the genders, was overwhelmingly good. The relationship between humanity and the rest of creation was radically good. There were no whales that needed to be saved on that day. There were no walruses that were worried on that day. Why? Because there was truth-telling. There was reciprocity. There was justice. There was equity. There was care on that day. And the relationship between all of creation, including us, and the systems that govern us was radically good, because all worked to bless all on the first page of the Bible. And now if you flip back a little earlier in the same day, you'll actually see the word Selem. You'll see, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, our Selem, according to our likeness, our demuth, and let them have dominion, have rada. Those are the other three words that I want to share with you. Over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And so dominion and Selem and rada are essential to understand. If you don't get these three words, personally, I don't think you understand the Bible. So let's talk about Selem quickly. Selem is the image of God. We are created in the image of God. And actually what that word really means, literally, is the representative figures of God. Now, as the ancients would have understood this, it is deep to consider this, y'all. Back in those days, they understood the image of the king, or the image of the pharaoh, or the image of the ruler, to be a marker of where that ruler lives, where that ruler rules, rather. And so that ruler would put a statue of themselves at the entrance of the city. They would have coins with their picture on it and let those coins go throughout the empire. And as that empire saw those coins, they would know, oh, this is where Caesar rules. This is where Pharaoh rules. So what does it feel like to be a marker of where God rules? To be made in the image of God. That's our first question. Are you a marker of where God rules? But also, this is a revolutionary moment, because never before in the history of civilization until this moment, when the writers of Genesis 1 actually write this down, never before had anybody ever placed the image of God inside everybody. They had only placed the image of God inside the kings and the queens. But here, these priests who are about to exit, they are exiting Babylon and about to enter into their own rule in the temple. They could have snatched power for themselves. They could have said, and God said, let us make the priests in our image. And nobody would have been the wiser, because that's the way it had always been. But that's not what they did. Instead, they cast power. They cast agency. They cast the ability to make determinations about how the world would live together out to everyone. Everyone. They placed the image of God, inherent human dignity, in everyone. And then, in case you don't understand the implications of this, they made it really clear. They said, and let them have dominion. And that word dominion has been sorely misunderstood for like ever. Some people have actually said that it means to dominate even unto obliteration, but it doesn't. What that word rada meant in the text is actually to steward. It's closer to steward. It literally means to tread down. But and some people, that's why they get it twisted, because that feels really violent, right? But it's actually in the context of the very beginning of the vegetation coming up all over the place. And what God was saying was, keep the right relationship between all of creation. Steward this to make sure that your relationship stays tov me'od. And there's a fourth word, and that word is the word demuth. We are made in the image and likeness of God. Now, some people have said, well, that just means we're like God. Well, yeah, but no. There's more to it than that. That word demuth actually means we are like God, but we are not God. We are not God. Now, friends, I believe that the reason why we have the world as we have it right now is because of sin. And the sin, the principal sin, I believe, of people coming out of Europe in particular, has been to war with God for supremacy. And the reason why I say that is because only God should be able to say that a human being is 3/5 of a human being and not a full human being. Only God gets to say if something is a savage or an animal or a human being. Only God. And yet, through our legal system, our laws, it was declared by people of European descent on this land, circa 1662 was when the very first race law happened, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But there were declarations made that were legal declarations that shaped then the course of our lives together, that were created, they were made according to an ideology, an understanding, a worldview of the world that believed in and bowed down to human hierarchy. And as a result, corrupted its own democracy. Let's talk about democracy for a minute. You see, the implication of those 4 words that I just shared with you is that if you are human, then you are created in the image of God. Can we all agree? Now, if you are created in the image of God, then you are created with the call of God and the capacity, all things being equal, to exercise dominion in the world. Can we all agree? So if you are created to exercise dominion in the world, and you then live in a society, in a world that limits your capacity to exercise that dominion, then what is happening is the image of God itself is under attack in that land. Now, democracy, it is flawed, and yet it is the very best system of governance that we have in the world today that makes it possible for the image of God to flourish. Why? Because it gives each citizen the ability to exercise the most fundamental right, the right to exercise agency. How? Through the vote. If you have nothing else, you have your vote. You have the ability to use your mouth, to use your body, to go into the voting booth and click and say, this is the world that I want. But when democracy is under threat, then the image of God is under threat in the land. Now, MLK, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in Where Do We Go From Here? I'm not going to read too much of it because we've already gotten a lot of the speech and it was fabulous. But what he said in Where Do We Go From Here is that segregationists have declared that democracy, I want to bring up, oh yeah, you can go to the next slide. Sorry, thank you. And the next one. So segregationists have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. The segregationist goal is the total reversal of all reforms, with re-establishment of naked oppression, and if need be, a native, read American, form of fascism. He said that in 1967. So friends, MLK saw it, and I believe that we see it in our own families' histories. And so I want to share with you a little bit from my family's history out of this book, Fortune. And I'll tell you the reason why am I talking about family history is because as I was researching, and I've been researching my family for 30 years, y'all, yes. I mean, I am a genealogy buff. I really am. I am like, an armchair historian that I've learned so much just by researching the family story. And what I found in researching my family, I found Fortune. And I found that Fortune existed at the very time when the very first race laws were being created. And so I want to share with you a little bit about her story. My mom, when I was growing up, she used to sing over my bed as I was going to sleep. She would sing, "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." And that was a song she taught me that was sung when somebody was going to run from the plantation. Someone was going to take their own image of God in their hands and run. And they would say, you got to wade into the water because the water is the place where the dogs can't sniff you. The water is the place where you'll be able to get past all the dogs. They won't be able to track you. But the water was also the place where alligators lived. Anybody see that movie, Emancipation, with Will Smith? Somebody say hello. Okay, if you haven't seen it, you must see it. I think it's on Apple Plus. You can watch it, right? So that's where I realized, this was not just mosquitoes, like malaria-ridden mosquitoes. This was alligators that were up in here. But as Harriet Tubman would have told us, they had to go through the water if they wanted to reach freedom. My friends, we have to go through the water. We have to go through the water. We have to face the alligators in our history and in our present if we want to reach freedom. We cannot get there. We will not be able to get there by paving over the past and pretending it's not there. Yes. We got to go through the water. So in my effort to go through the water, I found Fortune. Now, Fortune was born in 1687. She was born to a mother, Maudlin McGee, and a father, Sambo Game. Sambo Games, yes, Sambo, yes. But he was not the very first Sambo. Sambo literally means second son. It's a Senegalese name. It's on the southeastern edge of Senegal. That name was popular. On the southwestern edge, or in the western part of Senegal, it was Samba. And so there were a lot of Sambos here in the United States. Before it was even the United States. He was born circa 1670 and was brought in a slave ship to the eastern shores of Maryland. About 4 years after Maudlin McGee was brought with her husband, George McGee. And they met, they had an affair. Yes, they had an affair. And they had Fortune. Now, Fortune was the product of this mixed race marriage because Maudlin McGee was Ulster Scot. She was an indentured servant, likely fell in love with him in the midst of, them serving together somewhere. Now, the first race laws in Maryland were crafted for exactly to deal with that circumstance, where a white woman falls in love with and marries, actually. This is not, Maudlin did not marry Sambo, but Maudlin fell in that same kind of, that circle, because apparently a lot of white women were falling in love with black men and marrying them circa 1682, 1664, actually 1664 on. In 64, the legislature in Maryland, the colony of Maryland, said, we got to deal with this. And so what they decided was that any white woman who fell in love with and married a black man who was enslaved should herself be enslaved to his master. And her children would be enslaved in perpetuity. In perpetuity. And they got that phrase, in perpetuity, from Virginia, who had just passed its own very first race laws 2 years before, where they were dealing with a similar issue, but on the flip side of the coin, of black women being raped by enslaving white men. And they were now producing mixed race children, and these children were then going to court and arguing their case in court. Why? Because English common law said you could not enslave another British citizen, and citizenship came where? Through the line of the father. So if the father is British, then the child is what? British. And then if the child is what? British, then you cannot enslave that what? That child. And they said you can't enslave another Christian. So Elizabeth Key, circa 1654, we're working our way backward, can you see that? So Elizabeth Key, circa 1654, she said, wait a minute, my dad, who was a member of the House of Burgess, the legislators in Virginia, she said, my dad was a British citizen, and he recognized me as his daughter, and he had me baptized. Therefore, I should not be able to be enslaved. She took her case to court and won. Yes. And a slew of other people then came after her. And they began to win their cases. People who were mixed race black and white, people who were mixed race native and white, began to win their cases. So around 1662, when the House of Burgesses looked up and saw that there was a stream of people leaving the plantation saying, yo, I'm out. I'm a British citizen. You can't, they said, we have to change the law. Now, they didn't have to do that, right? They could have decided in that moment, we are going to change the law. We are going to do away with this slaveocracy. We are going to do away with this indentured stuff. We're going to actually become an actual capitalist society. We're going to pay people what their work is worth. And therefore, we're going to pour more money into the economy. More people will be able to buy our products, and we're going to become a prosperous nation. But that is not what they did. Instead, they said, we are going to change where citizenship comes from. Citizenship hereafter shall no longer come through the line of the father, but now shall come through the line of the mother in perpetuity. And that, my friends, is how race-based slavery began in America. That's how the hierarchy of human belonging was legally instituted and created deep grooves that then whole human people groups then had to be funneled through in America. 1662. So 1664 is when Maryland said, oh, you know what? We have an opposite problem. We're going to deal with it similarly. And then Fortune is born in 1687. And by that time, they've done away with the whole white women are going to be enslaved thing. They said, oh, that's not going to work very long. Because why? Because farmers began to force their indentured white women servants to then marry enslaved black men so that they would get free labor for at least in the remaining years of the husband's life and in perpetuity all of her children, right? So they changed that. They said, okay, that's not really what we had in mind, so we'll change that. So when Fortune was born, she really shouldn't have been indentured or enslaved. There was no law that said anything. But after she was born, there was an uptick in the number of people of Africa who were brought onto the shores of the Eastern Shore. And by about 1705, when we find Fortune in court, you actually see that the majority of people living in on the southern shore of Maryland, the eastern shore of Maryland, are black. The majority. And that demographic shift got folk nervous. And so what did they do? They began to clamp down on those slave laws. And they began to be more heinous and have higher consequences if people ran away. So they took Fortune to court. Post haste. She was already like 18 years old. And they said, because your mother is white and you are the product of a mixed race union, you need to be indentured, because by that time it had shaken out so that if your mother was white, you could not be enslaved. But if your father was black, you would be indentured. So Fortune was indentured until the age of 31. And then 2 successive generations after her endured several more sets of these race laws, and they themselves were caught up in the indenturing laws. And they were saved from slavery by one fact: their great-grandmother was white. Because she was white, they could not be enslaved, but they were indentured. And those laws shaped the course of my family's history. I want to share with you one more story. This is the story of my mom. My mom was a member of SNCC back in the day. She actually dated Stokely Carmichael. Hello, somebody. For like a minute. Yes, she did. But it was serious. It was serious. In fact, they started dating in the summer of 1966 when he was down there, not when, but at the same time, same era, that he went down into Mississippi in order to finish James Meredith's march. And so on June 5th, 1966, James Meredith, whose body had absorbed the trauma of the University of Mississippi riot when he integrated its campus 4 years before, set out on a one-man march against fear from Memphis, Tennessee, to Jackson, Mississippi. Meredith wanted to encourage Black Mississippians to register to vote, to register to exercise RADA. He was shot down on day 2. Veteran Mississippi SNCC organizer Charles McLaurin recruited and partnered with Martin Luther King Jr. and SNCC's new chairperson, Stokely Carmichael, to pick up Meredith's march and finish in his name. Midway through the journey, McLaurin scouted a location in Greenwood, Mississippi, where the group could camp out overnight without harassment from local police. Tucked inside a close-knit Black community, Broad Street Park became the staging ground for Carmichael's most consequential speech. You can actually change to the next slide. Sorry. And the one after that. That's my mom, y'all. And she's cute. She's totally cute. So McLaurin scouted a location, and tucked inside of a close-knit Black community, Broad Street Park became the staging ground for Carmichael's most consequential speech. Organizers rode a pickup truck to the edge of the park. Carmichael had been picked up by local police and detained earlier that day, and he had just returned to the park when organizers called him to the truck, hoisted him onto its flatbed, and passed him the microphone. And he called the crowd to courage. Don't let them scare you when you start opening your mouth. Speak the truth. After admonishing the crowd to love their Blackness, to define themselves, to reject the white view of Blackness, and instead to be zeroed in on the heart of the matter, he said, "We have got to get us some Black power. We don't control anything but what white people say we can control. We have to be able to smash any political machine in the country that's oppressing us and bring it to its knees." Carmichael's call for Black power was immediately interpreted by many whites as a foreboding threat of violence or a call to become anti-white. It was neither. Carmichael, who later renamed himself Kwame Ture, seemed to cut time in half with his cry for Black power. Before this moment, people of African descent had lived under the hegemony of whiteness for 304 years. When the first race laws were passed in Virginia in 1662, and that hegemony told us we were not human, we were not beautiful, we were not meant to determine our own movement, our family structures, our language, our religion, our future. We were not meant to steward land, only to work it for the benefit of whites. We were meant to be ruled. We were created by God to lick white men's boots and make them shine and like it. We were not even meant to have boots. This was the theological lie, my friends. According to Genesis 1:26 and 27, if a person is human, they're created by God with the call and capacity to steward the world, to make decisions that impact the world. So the core sin, and I repeat it here, the core sin of people of European descent has been to claim exclusive right to humanness, and thus the exclusive right to steward the world. So Carmichael's call was rebellion against a lie. It was a clarion call for people of African descent to embrace their Blackness and their humanness, to embrace the truth that white people are not God. They are merely human. They do not get to determine the boundaries of beauty. They do not get to determine the boundaries of Black flourishing. They do not get to shape our own views of ourselves. We determine our worth. We determine the boundaries of our flourishing. We determine how we will view ourselves. And this self-determination is not limited to the realm of cultural and social discourse. If we are human, then we are created to flourish and exercise agency in the world, economic and political, as well as social and cultural agency. So, my friends, how do we repair what race broke in the world? You can move to the next slide. How do we repair it? You see, through my family story, through your family stories, we can see the ways that democracy has been crushed, democracy has been smothered, democracy has been pushed back in order to maintain the legal and economic and social supremacy of whiteness on this land. And that is a project that happened because folk in Europe were trying to escape the feudal system of Europe where they could not flourish. And so they recreated that system here and racialized it so that they all from Europe would be at the top. They would be able all to flourish at the top. But in order to do that, they had to get some free land and they had to get some free labor. And in order to do that, they had to create what? A caste system. Y'all, next thing you do this week after reading Where Do We Go From Here? And after reading Fortune is go see Origin. It's coming out this week on Friday, I believe. It's the 19th it comes out. Origin. It was inspired by the book Caste. So, how do we repair what race broke in the world? Go to the next slide. We repair through truth-telling. We got to tell the truth about what we see in the water. We got to tell the truth. We got to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. In love, but we got to tell it. We can't talk around it. We can't sugarcoat it. We can't whitewash it. We got to speak it. We got to say it clearly. Now, the thing about telling truth is that you actually have a situation where the truth, it requires humility. Go to the next slide, please. It requires truth-seeking and truth-listening and then truth-telling. Truth-seeking requires the humility to know that you don't know everything, that you need the stories of others to fill in what you don't know. Truth-listening honors those whose very image of God has been denigrated over the years by sitting at their feet and listening, taking in their story, letting their story become a part of your story. And then finally, truth-telling is a part of the work of repair because it actually shifts, it reforms, it makes the narrative itself born again. Next slide. The next thing we need to do is we need to do some reparation, some repair. And that reparation, I'm informed by this amazing passage in 2 Samuel. You can go to the next slide. 2 Samuel 1 through 14 is 21, 1 through 14. I'm informed by that text, and I want to take you to it quickly, where in this text you will find that, here we go, that you'll find that David is dealing with a drought in the land. And he doesn't know why. He actually literally is praying, God, why do we have a drought in the land? What did I do? Did I do something? Tell me what I did. And then he gets this brilliant idea. I'm going to call the Gibeonites. I don't know where this idea came from. Maybe it came from prayer. Hello, God spoke back, right? So he calls the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites come, and then they knock on the door, and David's like, okay, come on in. And they say, Mr. David, we have a bone to pick with you. So they were ready. They already had their council meeting. They were ready for a meeting with the king. And so they came to him and they said, we have a bone to pick. Saul, the previous president, the previous ruler, the previous person, not you, but the previous, and the historical ruler did something to us. And so things are not right with you. Our relationship is not right. He tried to commit genocide against us, and he wasn't supposed to do that. So what did David do? Did David say, ooh, I'm sorry, next? Did David do what America has done and not even say sorry to people of African descent? Not in any real significant way. No, what David did was David did something I can barely imagine us doing here in the United States. David said to the Gibeonites, what do you say needs to be done, that we need to do in order for things to be made well with you? What do you say? David humbled himself. David put himself and his kingdom at the mercy of the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites came back and they said, we have a solution. And it was painful, this solution. It was costly. But it was not an eye for an eye, which also in itself is instructive. And you know what David did? He did it without asking even one question. He just did it. And we know how God felt about it because it says later in the text, after that, God heeded supplications for the land. God healed the land. So what would it look like for us to move toward repair of this land? By fixing the relationship that was broken the first moment that those slave ships landed on the shores of Africa with the doctrine of discovery in their hand and said, if this land is not civilized, then we have the right to colonize that land. We have the right to take your people and enslave them. That's when the relationship broke. When they did not recognize the image of God staring back at them. The call of God on the people to exercise agency over their own land and their own families and their own bodies. So repair will require us to go back to the moment of the break and fix it. And then finally, next slide. Beloved community, which comes through forgiveness and healing, I'll add. And we'll talk more about forgiveness, I think, when Angela comes up. But I want to share with you just a picture of the beloved community that comes from the very last page of the book. People have asked me, what do you hope to accomplish through Fortune? This is it. There are two paths set before the oppressed. One path leads to rage, compounded pain, sickness, and death. The other leads to the beloved community. On that road, there is truth-seeking, truth-listening, and truth-telling. There is reparation and equity, and there is mercy, release, forgiveness. For the sake of my body and soul and the bodies and souls of my family's descendants to the 10th generation from me, I choose the beloved community. For readers in European bodies, you also have a choice. You can continue your war for supremacy against God. You can continue to resist God's beloved community. Resist truth, resist equity, resist justice, resist mercy. You can try to maintain your space at the top of a crumbling racial hierarchy. You won't be there long. I mean, you're already in the global minority, and within one generation, read about 15 years, you will be in the minority in the United States as well. And when that day comes, you can wage war, or you can lean in to truth. Lean in to repair and allow yourselves to be released, forgiven. Only then can we find a new way of being together in the world. Now I can almost imagine, I can hear my 7 times great-grandmother, Fortune Game McGee, who walked this land 10 generations ago and absorbed the wrath of its first race laws and gender laws and citizenship laws into her traumatized body. And in my mind's ear, I can hear her whisper, "Yes, child, yes." Amen.